So it never ceases to amaze me, the erudition of some of these authors of the Buddhist books that I poke my nose into. It makes me feel actually quite inadequate in terms of my own academic grounding in some of the Buddhist tradition and the various perspectives that have been expressed by different Buddhist authors, not just contemporary, but obviously also throughout history. What I want to do in this particular video is to recite a couple, 3-4 paragraphs from a book by Peter Gregory on the topic of Tsung-mi and the Sinification or Sinification of Buddhism. And Tsung-mi, or Kui Feng Tsung-mi, apparently lived between 781 and 841 in a period in China when the Buddhist doctrine was really becoming increasingly embedded within the Chinese culture. And again, there were various perspectives and scholarly studies as far as trying to understand the nature of Buddhism and how it fit with the various indigenous Chinese belief systems and doctrines. And for this video, because it's a deep book with a lot of big words, I want to use my Google Home, which is I think of it as an artificial intelligence device, which is, for your information, a pretty cheap device, maybe $100, that is just, to me, amazing because it taps into the Google search engine to be able to answer questions that one puts to it. And again, I'll use it mainly for definitions. So for example, I use the word erudition. So let's just ask Google and say, hey Google, what's the definition of erudition?
Erudition, the quality of having or showing great knowledge or learning, scholarship.
Okay, so that's what I admire and what I feel humbled by when I read a lot of these authors. And in the title of this book, we have the word sinification or sinification. I think it means the acclimation into China or into the Chinese culture, but let's just see what Google has to say. Hey Google, what is the definition of the word sinification?
According to Wikipedia, sinicization, sinification, or sinification is a process whereby non-Chinese societies come under the influence of Chinese culture, particularly Han Chinese culture and societal norms.
So again, this book focuses on that process by which Buddhism integrated itself into the Chinese culture. And the section here pertains to Tsung-mi's, what he calls a 5-stage theory, explaining basically the various aspects of human experience relative to our state of suffering on up to our potential for enlightenment. And an interesting thing about it is that now he's explaining it from what we would think of as primarily a Yogacara or Yogacara point of view that also is related to Chan. And his main text apparently that he really hones in on is the Awakening of Faith Sastra, which I haven't really mentioned on this channel and which I may recite some excerpts from. But an interesting aspect is that the author notes the similarities between Tsung-mi's way of thinking about these different levels and the 12-fold chain of causation that was developed within the earlier form of Buddhism, the Theravada school. So what is said here is that Tsung-mi explains how the world of delusion and defilement, the world in terms of which unenlightened beings experience themselves, how it evolves out of a unitary ontological ground. Hey Google, what does the word ontological mean?
Ontological, relating to the branch of metaphysics dealing with the nature of being.
Okay, so the nature of being or the nature of reality, I'm going to go back, that the world of delusion and defilement evolves out of a unitary ontological ground that is both intrinsically enlightened and pure. So there's this underlying ground of being. Us beings, suffering and delusion is a function of the epistemological dualism out of which the world of their inner experience is constructed. Hey Google, what does the word epistemological mean?
Epistemological, relating to the theory of knowledge, especially with regard to its methods, validity, and scope, and the distinction between justified belief and opinion.
So, a function of the epistemological dualism, in other words, how do we know what we know, and in what way do we attain that knowledge? And we've heard over and over through the Prajnaparamita Sutras and other teachings within Mahayana that the dualistic perspective is, in a sense, the fundamental problem. So here what is being said is that, again, beings suffering in delusion, us beings being delusional, ignorance, one of the three poisons, or delusion, is a function of the epistemological dualism out of which the world of their experience is constructed. So we construct our world based on our thought system, which is basically dualistic. So he goes on. Religious practice thus entails the recovery of a primordial state of perfection before the bifurcation of consciousness into subject and object. While the terms in which Tsung-mi explains his theory are thoroughly Buddhist, his underlying cosmogonic model is one that has deep resonances with indigenous Chinese models. Now, I just want to stop there because I don't think Google will know that word cosmogonic or cosmogonic. And in a footnote on the next page, he says, I am here using cosmogony or cosmogony in the sense of the original Greek term or terms from which the word is derived, namely an account of the genesis of the cosmos. This usage is in keeping with the definition Charles Long gives in his entry on cosmogony in Volume 4 of the Encyclopedia of Religion. Quote, cosmogony thus has to do with myths, stories, or theories regarding the birth or creation of the universe as an order, or the description of the original order of the universe. So the author, Peter Gregory, says, I would accordingly distinguish a cosmogony from a cosmology in the following way. Whereas the former has to do with an account of the origin of the universe, the latter has to do with a description of the structure of the universe. Buddhist cosmology thus refers to theories about the three realms of being, or the six modes of existence, and so forth. So back to the paragraph. While the terms in which Tsung-mi explains his theory are thoroughly Buddhist, his underlying cosmogonic model is one that has deep resonances with indigenous Chinese models. Such models presume that the world is generated through a process by which an originally undifferentiated whole divides into a primordial polarity, through whose interaction the world of differentiated phenomena is then generated. So it's by this bifurcation, this dualism, that in effect we create the world that we perceive, is my understanding of what he's saying. And then the author goes on to say, although its content is different, Tsung-mi's theory has the same soteriological function in his thought that the 12-link chain of conditioned origination had in early Buddhism. Let's test Google Home on that one. Hey Google, what does soteriological mean?
Soteriology, the doctrine of salvation. So
this is where we get into the religious aspect, the religion, the desire of humans to be saved, if you will, by ideally some external force that sort of plucks us out of this state of suffering or samsara, which of course Buddhism doesn't necessarily provide in its earlier form, but that kind of evolves through the Pure Land kind of approach. And of course, in a fundamental way, all Buddhism is intended to help beings with their suffering. In other words, to give us tools to be able to have a better handle on transcending this dualistic fog, and to be able to know in a deeper way the nature of that primordial reality or fundamental ground. So here the author quotes Frank Reynolds as saying that the 12-link chain represents a, quote, samsaric cosmogony. The cosmos in question, of course, is not the, quote, objective universe that exists independent of being's perception of it, nor is it the creation of a single act that takes place in the beginning of time. Rather, and this is the the description or the what is being purported by the early Buddhists is that the quote cosmos is one that is continually generated through being's construction of it, that we construct the reality that is the framework for our suffering. As it functions in early Buddhist psychology, the 12-link chain of conditioned origination presents a coherent theory of the process of world construction by which, here's what we do, by which beings ensnare themselves in self-reinforcing patterns of thought and behavior that keep them bound to the relentless wheel of birth and death. The 12-link chain might thus be better characterized as a psychocosmogony. Okay? Insofar as it offers an etiology of samsaric existence, the 12-link chain correlates with the second noble truth, the origin of suffering. As the structure of the Four Noble Truths makes clear, the third noble truth, that of cessation, is made possible by the second noble truth. It is because the process by which beings become bound in samsara is based on a complex pattern of conditioning that liberation is possible. Because this chain, if that's the way we want to conceive of it, which certainly is as good as any other way, given the fact that all conceptions are basically provisional in their ability to pin reality down in a definitive way, that again, it is because the process by which beings become bound in samsara is based on a complex pattern of conditioning that liberation is possible. Because it's conditioning, we can uncondition ourselves. He goes on, that is, because the process by which this whole mass of suffering comes about is predicated on a series of conditions, it is possible to reverse the process by successively eliminating the conditions on which each link in the chain is predicated. Thus, the Buddha's enlightenment is often described in terms of his successive reversal of each link in the 12-fold chain of conditioned origination. And then the author actually gets into some very interesting and worthwhile detail regarding the 12-fold chain, but a couple of pages later ties back to Tsung-mi, where he says, Tsung-mi's 5-stage cosmogony stands on the same premise as the 12-link chain of conditioned origination. That is, it is only through insight into the complex process of conditioning by which beings become ever more deeply bound in self-reinforcing patterns of thought and behavior that they can begin to deconstruct the process, thereby freeing themselves from bondage. Again, it is the reciprocality of the two directions in the process that enables the 5 stages in the process of phenomenal evolution to provide a map for Tsung-mi's explanation of the nature and course of Buddhist practice. So he gets then into Tsung-mi's theory. And so if you have an interest in this, I'll put up a picture of the cover of this book, which includes, by the way, a neat drawing of the Buddha, flanked by Lao Tzu representing Taoism, and Confucius, of course, the other major religion that was in existence when Buddhism came on the scene. And I just might close with this reflection, is that it's clear from this book, and of course I was aware of that in general terms, but when Buddhism came to China, it took hundreds of years for it to be integrated into the Chinese culture. And so for those of us in the West, we've made tremendous strides in terms of Buddhism being exposed to people here in the West in recent decades, but it may take a long time before it becomes fully integrated, I guess is my point.